Good evening, everybody. On behalf of staff and the board of my Victorian History Library, I'm very pleased to welcome you. Yeah. Okay. I'm very pleased to welcome you all here. We are expecting quite a few more people, so they may drift in, so just bear with us. For those of you who have not met before, my name is Judith Ellis, and I'm President of the Library and Chair of the Board. So, on behalf of everybody, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we work and meet today. And the library is located on the lands of the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people of the Kulin Nation. And we pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Sovereignty has never been ceded. It always was and always will be Aboriginal land. And we acknowledge the First Nations people's rich history of knowledge keeping and knowledge management that causes an inspiration to us all in this environment. Ellen's going to do some admin announcements and then I'll introduce our speaker today. Kat.
Thank you very much, Judith. So my name is Ellen, I'm the collections librarian here. My pronouns are she and her. I'm just going to take you through some very basic admin. So here's the bathroom. It's just go out right and there's the first door on the left. In a very unlikely event of an emergency, we have an emergency exit at the stairs and at the front of the building. Follow one of the staff, just go in the direction the fire isn't. That usually works pretty well. So we're delighted to have you here to participate and share in this evening. And we're pleased to welcome you that are new to the library and familiar faces. For those of you who don't know, the PMI Victorian History Library is the second oldest library in Victoria. We were founded in 1854. We collect all aspects of Victorian history and interstate and national materials, Victorian content and influence. We've got more than 40,000 items on site, the majority of which are for loan. And you can see a selection of our queer history in the cabinets. All of it is for loan, apart from the very new History of the Victorian Pride Centre on top of the cabinet up there, because I haven't had time to catalogue it yet. I bought it on Friday. So yeah, our collection is local history and we hold information on most towns in Victoria, but it's broader than that as well. We make sure that there's a lot of thematic collection to inform the rest of the history. Just to let you know, we will be taking photographs throughout the event. If anyone has any issue with that, come and see myself or Judith. And we are filming this too. You guys aren't in shot, we've just got the camera set up over there. And so yeah, if anyone has any problems with that, just don't wander in front of the camera basically. And then I'll hand back to Judith to introduce our guest for tonight.
Thanks, Ellen. So tonight, we'd like to welcome you to what we found when we went looking for Victoria's queer heritage. We were very pleased and excited to have Dr Graham Willet back with us, who is the lead author and researcher of the report, A History of LGBTQI Victoria in Places and Objects. It was published just last year. And Graham did this talk for us earlier in the year during Midsumma week. And we'll also be doing another talk for us, I think, next year in Midsumma, which will be wonderful. And Graham's going to take us through the process and the results of the report and all the fascinating things that he actually found along the way. Just as a bit of background, Graham is an author of and contributor to books, journals and other texts, as well as doing research for a number of very interesting projects. And one of your books, which I mentioned just before, I think we've got here, Living Out Loud, A History of Gay and Lesbian Activism in Australia, published in the year 2000. And the Amazon summary tells us, from Fred Nile to the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence, Living Out Loud is the first full-length history of the Australian gay and lesbian movement. So it would have been quite a bestseller, I imagine, in its time. It probably still is, or hopefully still is. Graham was a senior lecturer in Australian Studies at the University of Melbourne and has also been a member of the Australian Lesbian and Gay Archives for many, many years, and was on the committee for many, many years and president for 17, 18 years, something like that, which is fabulous. So the topic for today, History of LGBTIQ Victoria in 100 Places and Objects, was commissioned by Heritage Victoria to highlight the rich, diverse and unique history of queer communities in Victoria and to demonstrate how these communities are reflected in places, objects and landscapes that surround us all. Again, an abstract of the report says the experiences and voices of queer communities have not commonly been included in the historical record. Consequently, queer heritage has remained largely invisible. So I'm going to hand over to Graham now to make this heritage more visible and to tell us about his report and what he found. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. As has, sorry, yeah. You can hear me okay? Yep. As has been mentioned, this report, I'm here today to report on the report, the history of LGBTIQ plus Victorians in 100 objects and places. Like any report, it includes definitions, terminology, methodology. There's a section on language, which I'll come back to a bit. Plus, of course, the 100 objects and places that we identified. 245 full-colour A4 pages, conveniently available for purchase down the back at the end of this. The report began life in 2018 during the state election of that year, when the Victorian Labor Party committed itself to a whole raft of issues surrounding queer Victorians, including a commitment to talk more, to ensure there was more understanding of the queer history and heritage of the state. Once they won the election, it's then passed to Heritage Victoria to implement this policy. Heritage Victoria is the state government body that deals with all non-Indigenous heritage matters. So identification, registration, protection are part of its job. They in turn then contracted with the Australian Queer Archives, then the Australian Lesbian and Gay Archives, to produce, as they said, a publicly accessible study which lists between 70 and 100 places and objects of most significance to the LGBTIQ community across Victoria. The fact that we usually refer to this as the Heritage 100 report gives you a sense of where we landed in terms of the 70 to 100, although in fact it's not entirely accurate even then. The question of why the archives took it on, first of all, they're offering money. You'd be surprised how rarely voluntary organisations get offered money by the big institutions. They often feel like they're doing us a favour by letting us contribute to their exhibitions and so on. We're an entirely volunteer organisation. We're funded entirely by the members, membership and donations. And that leads to, that's a result of the fact that we don't get any ongoing government funding, we don't get any ongoing philanthropic funding. We do get funding for projects like this one. So, you know, that was a reason for us to get involved. From the other side, it was kind of inevitable that we would be the selected body to do this report. The collection is really quite a remarkable one. We think we've got about 600 plus shelf metres of material, and it's a collection of books and magazines, newspapers and newsletters, badges, T-shirts, posters, ephemera, audio-visual materials. So we collect pretty much everything, up to including recently some costumes from prominent drag personalities. Our job, as we said, is to collect and preserve this material, but also to celebrate it, by which we mean activities to draw attention to the material and to the history that it embodies. This might be exhibitions and displays, ones that we do for ourselves, or we do in collaboration with other institutions. The big NGV Queer exhibition, for example, last year was helped, where we helped put that together. History walks, publishing, lectures like this, and of our own. The way we did this was, given the size of the collection, it would have been relatively easy for us to have simply sat down and drawn up a list of the 100 objects and places. In fact, we were quite conscious of wanting not to do that. We wanted to draw the community in, partly because that's our focus for almost everything we do, but also because we thought there was a fair chance that we would find materials, objects and places that we weren't aware of. And that turned out to be the case. there's stuff in the report that was not kind of at front of mind for us. Even if, strictly speaking, a lot of the ideas were given weren't heritage, and I'll come back to what that means in a second, our job as kind of custodians of the history of queer Victoria and Australia, in fact, we're a national organisation. Nonetheless, it's useful for us as historians to have whatever people know or think they know or are suggesting in terms of the history, even if it didn't meet the needs of heritage as such. We were very keen to make sure we included not just the inner city, which is where most of the history is known and celebrated, not just Victoria. I mean, the report talked about it has to be Victorian-wide, so not just regional, rural, but also to include suburban experiences, habit, objects and places. And this, I think, is still the most underexplored aspect of queer history in Victoria. The suburbs tend not to be very prominent, although particularly around local libraries, that's starting to change. And places way out, which I think of as way out there, as Narre Warren and so on, and the Western Footscray, the visibility of queer history is becoming more obvious. We're also very keen that our diversity should not just run across the LGBTIQ plus spectrum or categories, but also across the other kind of ways in which queer people live, issues of class, location, race, ethnicity, and so on. This is something the Archives is very keen to make sure we do represent, and have been doing so for the best part of, for more than 40 years. One of the ways in which the Heritage Victoria were able to help us was through a project called Engage Victoria. This involves the Victorian government setting up websites to collect information. And there are lots of these around all sorts of different projects and consultations that they're doing. So it provided an opportunity for people to suggest places or objects, their reasons why they thought it would be useful to include that, and their other thoughts, including some demographic data about age, identity, and so on. The very first response we got on our site, we're terribly excited, we got a response. It was someone complaining about spending government money on this sort of thing. It was a little bit disappointing. And there was a level of anxiety around that, which went away because the rest of the 150 or more than 150 contributions were much more positive and engaged seriously in trying to give us ideas that we could include. We also, of course, used Facebook and the other social media, Twitter, our own webpage, and we engaged in face-to-face activities. At Midsumma Carnival, for example, we always do a history walk, so we use that to promote the project. The AIDS Council does a history walk at Fairfield Hospital. We participate in that and contributed. We gave a talk at Hobson's Bay Library. We also used the Midsumma Carnival Day to, in our tent and on our display, we got a big map of Victoria and a big map of Melbourne, and we invited people to put pins in to tell us about places they knew of that we should include, and that really kind of generated a lot of interest. There were more formal public consultations, such as at Hobson's Bay Library, and there would have been others except, well, you know, the COVID virus broke out, and that really limited the amount of face-to-face work that we could do. However, we did manage to organise meetings with the National Trust, with Heritage Victoria's archaeologists, individuals in the field, and for a while that was difficult to move around Melbourne without being buttonholed by somebody who wanted to tell you about something you should include. So on the tram coming down St Kilda Road one day, somebody from the Victorian AIDS Council went on pointing out a whole lot of stuff that relevant to AIDS, you know, the kind of memorial garden at Fairfield, the fact that the AIDS ribbon is different in Victoria than it is in other states. This is stuff that we either might not have thought of, or in the case of the ribbon, I didn't even know. So this kind of process of accumulating knowledge and information and ideas was a really important part of the process and took the thing much more broadly than it would otherwise have gone. One of the issues that we talk about in the report, one of the issues that comes up a lot in discussions these days is the question of language. How do we talk about ourselves? What kind of words do we use to describe ourselves? You know, going back to the early days of colonisation, when sodomy and homosexuality and so on were the kind of words that we used. by the church and by the law, buggery by the law, the medical terms, legal terms, the way ordinary people talked about us in ways that were not used by respectable middle-class people. And of course, the way we talked about ourselves in particular. For a long time, beginning certainly in the 30s and into the 40s, the word most commonly used by homosexual people, men and women, to describe themselves was camp. So male camps, female camps, camps. Until the 1960s, it was all spelt with a K, K-A-M-P, which was said to stand for known as a male prostitute or known associate of male prostitute. We think this is not true, actually, but we get to tell the story anyway, as long as we admit afterwards that it's not true. It's called a backronym. You start with a word that you want to use, and then you go backwards to say what it might mean. And there's quite a lot of it around, actually. The new identities that have emerged beginning in the 80s and 90s, demanding recognition, respect and reforms, which is where the LGBTIQ plus A+ comes from. It's an emerging reality that is reflected in a language that some people find kind of clunky, but it has the purpose, the intention of drawing attention to the real diversity of this community. The methodology was a bit of a learning curve, really. We had, for example, to distinguish between heritage and history. As an organisation, we were committed, well, the archives collected material, but usually turned it into history and talked about it in terms of the history that it revealed. The heritage industry, or the heritage sector, has a whole series of reports and regulations and guidelines and legislation to help Heritage Victoria and anyone engaging with it to identify the heritage that is significant. And certainly that was important. The Heritage Act, the Register of Criteria, the threshold guidelines and so on, helped guide what we were doing. But actually in the end we came to a much more simple conceptual distinction that history is about people and events and heritage is about places and objects. And once we had that, then we were able to focus what we were gathering. So we did gather a lot of new historical material, but it was heritage objects and places that we were interested in for the report. Heritage has certain kinds of concepts that are important. The place or the object must still exist. And it doesn't matter if the building's been repurposed for something else, it has to be there. When we do our history walks, for example, we spent a lot of time standing outside buildings saying, on this site there used to be. There's no point doing that for heritage. That's not what they want to hear. The thing itself needs to be of intrinsic value, intrinsically gay, lesbian, queer in some sense, so that, for example, a gay liberation badge has only one value. As a heritage object, it's produced by and for queer people, queer visibility and so on. And that's important too. It ought to be under normal heritage rules, unique itself, and there are certainly some that are like that, but we stretched that really to take sort of exemplary models, things that reported or referred to other objects, or to be of statewide significance. I never worked out what that meant, but nobody seemed to pull us up, so it didn't matter much. Heritage objects. In the end, we came to rely on criterion G from one of those reports, strong or special association with a particular present-day community or cultural group for social, cultural or spiritual reasons. And that let us, as long as we focused on places and objects, that let us draw quite broad definitional inclusion. Some places and objects do in fact have intrinsic queer content, the badge that I mentioned before. Others are places and objects that were felt to be significant to the community. And a really interesting example came up during the process of preparing the report. In Collingwood, there's a sex club for men called Club 80, and it's been there for about 30 years. During the period of our research, the club was closed down, the owner sold out, the building was sold, and the decision was made to gutted, essentially, that the facade is still there, but none of the rest of it is. Now that tells you it's not of intrinsic heritage important, it's not a particularly important building, but to the people who used the club, it was extraordinarily important. The outpouring of grief and stories and sadness was a really remarkable contribution to our understanding of the way in which a place can nonetheless have a great significance to large numbers of people. We also included, and there was a greater emphasis than usual, on intangible cultural heritage. And the example I like to use is the Black Rock Beach Beat. Beach is a place where men go to pick up or have sex with other men. The Black Rock Beach Beat was in a tea tree fringe between the beach and the road. And men had been going there, we don't know for how long, but in order to pick each other up. It was a very common place, reasonably well known. That in itself might make for a kind of cultural significance. It's not like it has any intrinsic cultural significance. I mean, the locals might think so. They might love their tea tree fringe and they might protest vehemently if an attempt is taken to tear it down. And you see that the way people become attached to individual places like that. But for us, what made it significant was a place where men had been going to seek sex or sexual partners for quite a long time. It developed a much higher significance over the summer of 1976-77 when the police launched a series of entrapment activities into the tea tree fringe. This was quite consciously a campaign, and they set about doing it quite systematically. They got attractive young police officers, trained them in how you identify homosexuals. I'd have thought wandering through the tea tree wearing not many clothes would have been enough, but no, they had to believe that there was a special walk, and they used binoculars to sort of watch the homosexuals and see how they walked. They arrested dozens of men, but because there was a political movement by that point, the movement was able to draw attention to this, to get it published in a way that most of these kind of campaigns weren't. It turned up in the newspapers, and a major controversy erupted, not about the fact that men were having sex or picking each other up for sex in public, but about the police wasting their time and resources on tracing this kind of activity. And out of that upsurge in interest and the push for the decriminalisation of sex between men became a real force, and it really mobilised, so that by 1980 the law reform had been introduced into the Victorian Parliament and passed. So this place, which has, an intrinsic significance maybe to the locals, a different significance to gay men, a different significance again to the history of the unfolding of law reform, becomes a sort of very complicated, multifaceted kind of place. Of course, that's relatively rare, that kind of really visible place, because queer heritage has often been overlooked or even consciously concealed. The destruction of letters and diaries and photos is very common. In fact, address books, people might well choose not to keep them for fear that they will fall into the wrong hands. Or relatives might decide to destroy them to protect their dead relatives' reputation. So the usual plethora of letters and diaries that historians often have access to do social histories, they don't exist, or they don't exist in anything like the same sort of numbers. The other thing, though, is that sometimes the Heritage Register overlooks the queer significance of something that has heritage significance. So this is a house called Corriul down in Geelong area, and this is built by, for Anne Drysdale and Carolyn Newcomb, and a mourning brooch that was produced after the older of the couple died. The house and the brooch are both of undoubted heritage significance. The house still stands, and it's been, I'm told, beautifully restored. The brooch is down at Geelong Way. The brooch is still intact and is in the State Library of Victoria, where because of its fragility, it's very hard to get access to it, but they did give us access. The brooch is made of strands of the hair of the two women bound together, spiraled together, and produced in this sort of beautiful rose gold ornament. It was a mourning brooch was a tradition of sort of Victorian society, Victoria as in Queen Victoria, where the surviving partner of a couple would have such a thing made to remember their loved one and to remind other people that they were remembering their loved one. So it was very clearly an expression of an intimate relationship between these two women. In fact, they ended up being buried together too. So it's hard not to see this for what it is. You really have to make an effort not to see them as a couple. But the Heritage Report doesn't have any of that kind of stuff. It acknowledges they're a couple of businesswomen and they worked as partners in a business sense, that they built and lived in the house, and so on. But it would be very easy to insert into this a discussion of the kind of relationship and how we have to go about defining it or exploring the relationship. And at one point it certainly came out of the report, the idea that maybe somebody should review the Heritage Register and see what's in there that could benefit from this kind of additional research and writing. Another example is Shed 14 down on the docks in what's in the Docklands precinct in Victoria. Shed 14 has a relevance to Victoria's maritime history and to trade and commerce, but it also has significance to queer people from the 1990s and afterwards when irregular dances were held there. And so they have a kind of an attachment. It's a place where events happened, and that makes it important as well. There's a lot of that. There could be a lot more of it done. The report, I'm not going to do that. In terms of identifying a community, it's very clear to us now that there is a community, and that while that's not true in the past, we can take people like us and look back at what they were doing, and that will give us a sense of connection. Anne Drysdale and insert name of other person here, yes, would not have identified as lesbians. They might well have identified as a couple. In fact, we kind of think they did from the diary entries, but that's not what they were. We claim them because they have some resonance for us in a way that they wouldn't necessarily recognise. We certainly have a community now. We embrace our history, and it's a community whose history and heritage has been occluded or concealed, transmitted by word of mouth across generations. A lot of the places, the beats in particular, we know because people reported on them, not because there was anything much in the archival record. Or it's found by recovery work, oral histories, newspapers, archives, police records, especially for homosexual men. Police records are a very rich resource. Trove, which is digitisation of Australian newspapers. Gale, which is a digitisation of Australian queer newspapers and magazines. All of these help us to discover a past that is not otherwise particularly easily accessible. So sometimes, especially for contemporary history, heritage significance might be obvious. Val's Coffee Shop. It's a building in Swanston Street on the ground floor and the mezzanine and first floor. In the early 1950s was a cafe, Val's Coffee Shop, run by a woman called Val, cleverly enough, but which was very welcoming to all kinds of bohemians in Melbourne, including camp women and men, theatricals, people in the theatre world, students and other kinds of bohemians, and again remembered long after it closed. A Club 80 I've already mentioned, a place that existed for about 30 years but lingers on because of its association for many people. When I talk about what we're looking for, it's not for evidence of genital contact, because actually you very rarely find that anyway when you're doing history. Heterosexual history is not usually defined by evidence of genital contact between a man and a woman. So what we're looking for